Hey, this is Larry from On Humans, and here is something from the archives. Here is an Encore episode which I thought fits into the moment because the past two episodes have looked at how climate has shaped the human story. And there really is no greater juncture where this is more obvious than in the origins of agriculture, how the ice ages end and humans around the world start farming. And for a long time I thought that this was no mystery. Well, obviously you're not going to farm if the world is icy. And it's much more complicated. And oh my god, it's much more interesting. And this is really one of my all-time favorite episodes, so I'm glad to put it here again. Enjoy. This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And today's conversation is about the origin of agriculture. Now, I probably don't need to convince you that agriculture is a massive, massive milestone. Perhaps the single biggest event in the history of humanity. Whether you think of agriculture as opening the doors to civilization or as the original sin, the worst mistake in the history of the human race, as Jared Diamond famously calls it, there is a certain puzzle that I don't think gets quite enough attention. The puzzle is why agriculture? Agriculture is not an obvious thing for humans to do. But since the dawn of humanity, humans have been living as hunter-gatherers, and suddenly everywhere around the world people start abandoning this lifestyle, settling down, farming the field. They do so without any obvious benefit to themselves. I mean, the farmers are clearly doing much worse health-wise on many, many, many indicators, as we will discuss in this conversation. So why did they do it? To discuss this matter, I'm joined by Andrea Matranga, an economic historian, who is one of the few people who actually has a theory about how this happens, which explains not just why it happens in the Middle East, but why it happens around the world, why it happens when it happens, and why do people do it and stick to it despite it being bad for their health. We talk about a lot of other things in this conversation. We talk about the spread of agriculture, how much was it spread because it was a good idea, how much was it spread by simply the migration of farmers, and how much was it spread by coercion, state violence, etc. Finally, we touched upon what thinking about the origin of agriculture has taught Matranga about the reduction of poverty in the 21st century. And as always, we finish with my guest's reflection on humanity. If you want to follow up on any of the names or technical terms that you hear in this conversation, you can head to show notes where you have a full list of them. There you will also find a link to my Substack article on this, which gives you both a kind of summary of Matranga's theory and a lot of useful links forward. I hope that you enjoy this conversation. If you do, and in general you appreciate On Humans as a program which makes new research in humanities and human sciences accessible to the general public and relevant to the big questions about the human condition, then do consider showing your support. You can do so at onhumans.patreon.com if you're a long-term listener or want to show long-term support. But you can also help me just by subscribing to the show, subscribing to my newsletter at onhumans.substack.com, and definitely giving a good review if you think that I deserve it. Those 5 stars really help the algorithms pick up the show and help other people find it then too. Thanks for your support. And whether you're commuting to work, running on a treadmill, or just wanting to learn more about humans, I'm really happy that you've decided to give some of your time today to this episode with Andrea Matranga. Dr. Andrea Matranga, welcome to On Humans.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
Okay, so the beginning of agriculture, it's known as the Neolithic Revolution. The term was coined by Gordon Childe, am I right?
Yes, I'll just say something interesting about the name, first of all. Gordon Childe was a Marxist archaeologist, so I think it's kind of interesting that he's calling it the revolution because, one of his points was actually that, you can do something for, tens and hundreds of thousands of years, and then you can do something different because you have a new technology and you can change everything. So it's sort of congruent with sort of his political views. He was emphasizing this revolutionary aspect of it.
Yes. And how did he explain it?
So for Gordon Childe, his idea was basically like there was already known that certain places like the Middle East had become drier around that time. And so his idea was that when things become drier, then people have to move into agriculture because there's just not enough natural food. So they try to make the most out of the resources that they can get in the places that do have some water. And that way they get into agriculture. One of the problems is that it happened at least in 7 places around the world that everybody agrees.
Let's do those, by the way. Let's do that. Let me try. So Middle East, we get wheat, barley, all of that good stuff. We get
Yes.
rice from southern China. From northern China, we get millet.
Yes.
We have potatoes, of course, and stuff like that from the Andes, from where the Incas later developed their things.
Yes.
We have maize from Mexico, where the Mayas and the Aztec get on later. What else I'm missing? We have sorghum from Africa.
Yes. Sorghum from the Sahel region. So, like that strip between the Sahara Desert and sort of the jungle.
I have to be honest also, I did not know what sorghum looks like until I read Moyan's Red Sorghum, and I really wanted to know what sorghum looks like, and I had to Google it because, again, it's not a staple in the Finnish or the British diet.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's not the staple in Italy as well. But they also got a different kind of millet in Africa in the Sahel region.
Okay.
So even though they're sort of related, it was sort of two completely different sequences with two completely different wild ancestors.
And I think that's really important because there is this way of, I think, somewhat ironically using this Marxist term of revolution and then bring in actually industrial revolution, which could be a very easy model. And this would be something, I mean,
Yes,
you're an economist, you're an economic historian, so it would be someone who just hears that you think about the agricultural revolution might immediately assume that you're importing a kind of steam engine model or something where some people have this amazing innovation. Oh, we can do this differently. And then it starts spreading.
exactly.
And I think that sounds like a good story, but there's two problems with that. One is that industrial revolution happens once and then it starts spreading. Agricultural
Yes,
revolution, it happens actually many. There's not one revolution, there's many, many revolutions, and these revolutionaries were not talking to each other. So it would be quite
yes.
weird if suddenly steam engines start popping up everywhere around the world between people who don't know about each other.
Well, one of the issues is one of sort of what's the time frame that we're discussing? Because I mean, these happen simultaneously in archaeological times, but there's still like about 6,000 years between when the
Yeah.
Middle East does it and when Eastern North America does it.
But I guess there is still the point that we have to explain not why someone figured out farming and how it spread, but we have to figure out why, after, since the dawn of humanity, people had been happy as hunters and gatherers.
Yes,
They suddenly, everywhere around the world, you start having these moments where people abandon that lifestyle.
absolutely.
And then it gets even weirder because, in a sense, with industrial revolution, the steam engine makes a lot of sense for the people who own the steam engines, the British capitalists. And it's not at all clear that agriculture makes a lot of sense. I mean, this is the classic Jared Diamond looking at the data suggested famously that, well, it might have been the worst mistake in the history of human race. And maybe he was exaggerating. Maybe we want to push back on that later. But the data he used is pretty robust, and it has stood the test of time, which is that farmers are not as healthy.
Yes, absolutely. So they're typically shorter by a few centimeters than ancestors from just a couple hundred years before. In the case of the Middle East, when they become sedentary, I think they lose almost 8 centimeters. And they also have more joint diseases. So you can see the joint wear on their, arms and sort of elbows and knees.
So they work either harder or less ergonomic positions.
Exactly. Or, you might think also that the kind of effort was very different from what we had evolved for. So perhaps like given another 50,000 years, we would have evolved like great elbows for grinding grains all day, but we weren't quite there yet at the time. And actually, just to sort of make a parallel with before, it's kind of interesting how theories of the Neolithic kind of track sort of political issues of the time. So, Virgo and Child obviously is coming at this from a Marxist perspective. If you look at
Yeah.
the article by Jared Diamond, which is, I think, late 80s, and obviously in the 80s, people were worried about overpopulation and they're worried about, look at humans, we think we know stuff, and
Yes.
then we do something and then we're worse off. And so, it's sort of like this provides background inspiration for people to find similar patterns also in historical.
Yeah, why don't you tell us what is the link? I mean, diamond links this to overpopulation, right? In a way that when you at first agriculture might be a good idea, but because it leads into rapid population growth, you can wean children earlier. You don't need to carry them, so you can have a lot of children. Suddenly, you end up having massive population rising as well.
Exactly. So his idea is before you could only carry the one kid. So you can only have one child that's sort of not walking at the speed of the group, if you're
Yeah.
nomadic specifically. And that means that, That plus whatever, you're exposed more to the elements, perhaps there's more danger, that puts a limit on population growth. And so that means that you don't reach that ultimate Malthusian limit, and therefore people are better off. And then instead, when you become sedentary, then what's going to happen is that you can have all the kids you want because you just keep them home and you don't have to carry them. And perhaps you also wean them earlier so you don't have this sort of period in which there's suppressed fertility because you're still breastfeeding.
which is a contraception. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I think this, at least for my money, it's pretty clear. We are. If in the 80s we were worried about population growth, now we're worried about climate change. So climate change.
Exactly. Exactly.
I mean,
So,
in some sense, what you're suggesting, by the way, is not new. I mean, when I first saw that, okay, there's a interesting paper linking agriculture to climate change, I was like, well, of course. And my naive theory was that, well, it's pretty obvious why agriculture started when it started. It's the end of the ice ages. It's the beginning of the so-called Holocene. And the era of the ice is not the time to sow the seed.
yes.
And now, well, now we can do it. Why was I wrong? Why is it not as simple as that?
So the reason you were right for the places where they did it. So if you look at the Middle East, it's absolutely true that during the Ice Age, it was much colder and you wouldn't have wanted to do agriculture then. The
Yeah.
problem with that is, again, when you look at it at a global scale with all the data we have now, we know that it's not like we had snowball Earth where the entire globe was cold.
Yes. Sudan was not an icy place. Yes.
Yes. So if all you needed was a warmer climate, such as the one that was prevalent in Mesopotamia, or the Fertile Crescent, which is the area north of Mesopotamia, around 11,000 years ago, then you could have done it perfectly fine 50,000 years ago. You just move 1,000, 2,000 kilometers south, and you would have similar climate averages.
I mean, I've become more and more, this is a bit of an aside, but I've become more and more unhappy kind of week by week with the terms that I grew up with, like the Ice Age, like the Stone Age, like because if you talk with someone, you talk with a son hunter-gatherer from the Kalahari Desert. Well, they didn't have an Ice Age in the Kalahari Desert. They were living in the quote-unquote Stone Age still, like very recently until that, so it's, these are pretty, if not Eurocentric, then Eurasia-centric labels.
Absolutely. No, and I would say Euro and Middle East, so Western Eurasian centric, which is
Yes,
when,
yes.
because these were the places that were first excavated, and it was what was available, and it's also what people were interested. There's like, where do we come from? And so obviously, and even today, if you compare like how many excavations have been done in, the Middle East versus how many excavations have been done in, the Sahel region of Africa, it's probably 50 or 100 to 1. So when we take all of these dates, we should also account for the fact that maybe we haven't found that earliest, Neolithic site in the Amazon jungle or in sub-Saharan Africa. And perhaps as we keep excavating this in 200 years, people might realize actually the first Neolithic was in the Caucasus or someplace completely different.
Yeah, so I guess that is a real possibility, but assuming that that's not the story, assuming that we are roughly right, we we need a
Yes.
theory. Yeah.
But I'm just saying, like, we have to, in the back of our mind, we have to be cognizant of this possibility. So it's much easier to find, remains of seeds and stuff like that in the Middle East than it is in other places.
Okay, but let's take stock quickly here. So we have a puzzle which is one of the most important puzzles to understand human story, which is why on earth did we go after being for hundreds of thousands of years? If we count this genus Homo, like millions of years,
Exactly.
we were happy as hunter-gatherers. Suddenly, around the world, a lot of hunter-gatherers start abandoning this lifestyle. They start settling down in villages and cities later on. They start farming, and this isn't just one wonderful idea that starts spreading. And it's happening around the places, and it doesn't seem to be a very good idea for the people involved. At least it's a pretty hard bargain in some sense. So we have to explain it. And you suggest already that, I mean, we've already touched upon the broad explanation is going to be around climate changes. I mentioned one that was my naive theory. It's because the ice melted. But that's not really a good theory, that it doesn't explain why there wasn't agriculture in Africa. Maybe there was, but probably no. You mentioned another climate-related theory, which is not your own, but which is an older one, and maybe we should address that briefly before we go to your theory. That theory was the dryness. So you mentioned
Yes.
that already in the very, very beginning, there was a suggestion that this is linked to climate change. This is linked to increased droughts. Could we maybe quickly go through why that is not a satisfactory answer in your opinion before we go into your satisfactory answer?
Well, the desiccation theory, which later became the oasis theory with Braidwood, like writing right after World War II, and so his version of this was that because of the desiccation, then people congregate in those places where there is water, close to rivers, close to oasis, and because of that, they become sedentary, and then agriculture comes from then having become sedentary. So that's this one step better because it also explains this chicken and egg problem of why would you become sedentary if you don't have farming. Now, the issue with that is, again, one of like that it happens in a bunch of different places, and not all of them have the same sequence of becoming drier. Eastern North America wasn't dry at any point. The northern China, for example, I don't think it was. So the basic point is it could explain certain sequences, but then you have to come up with different stories for all of these places. And then the question is, why did all these places have different stories that all led them to happen at the same, roughly at the same time in archaeological time?
Yeah, and by the way, am I speculating right? Could we apply the earlier logic to this one too, which is that there were probably dry places somewhere around the world also during the Pleistocene?
Absolutely. That's the same issue. And even if there were fewer, if you multiply how many thousands of years people, tens of thousands of years people in Africa, then if it's just like a percentage probability of like, if it gets lower than this level of dryness, the level of rainfall, then we start doing farming. It would have happened at some other point before.
Okay, so then I guess we're ready for your answer.
Yes.
Why agriculture?
The inspiration for this was partly this paper by Alain Testar, The Significance of Food Storage Among the Hunter-Gatherers, which is a 1982 paper. And in there, he's not talking about agriculture at all, but he's mainly discussing the fact that there's certain cultures, even in historical times, that are hunter-gatherers and they are sedentary. Actually, Pacific Northwest is the key example of this, but they become sedentary because they live in very seasonal environments where food is very abundant for certain parts of the year and very scarce in other parts of the year. And then what is the logical way of dealing with this? Well, if you can simply smooth your consumption. The economist term for this is consumption smoothing, and you just store food during the abundant season, and then you consume it during the scarce season. And that way you avoid the famine. Now, the problem with that is that food is very heavy. So once you want to have food for 6, 7, 8 months, it's impossible to carry that with you unless you have, wagons and, carts and stuff. In that case, you can.
In which case you get the Indo-European expansion 5,000 years ago, but let's not go into that.
Exactly. Absolutely.
So food storage is tough and it's very difficult to store it in a mobile fashion. Is that right? And so if you want to store, you have to become sedentary.
Exactly. And once you become sedentary, in order to store these wild foods, then it's actually much easier to do agriculture because, you're already sedentary, which you need, and you already know how to store food. And if you farm, you get paid once a year. The saying among farmers is farmers get paid once a year. So there's this huge amount of harvest, but then you have to have some way of smoothing it. So if you don't have a storage technology, farming can't work. So basically, becoming sedentary hunter-gatherers makes you pre-adapted for inventing agriculture.
And not even inventing necessarily. I mean, I was just going through Alice Roberts' book Tamed, which has 10 chapters on 10 different domestication events. Starts with dogs, chapter number 1. Chapter number 2 is wheat. And she at least has a very convincing theory about how accidental wheat domestication at least could have been. I mean, her theory is that we know, for example, from the Middle East that you have these, for example, the Natufians, who were
Right.
basically hunter-gatherers, but like you mentioned, they were storage hunter-gatherers. They were these kind of like the Pacific Northwest people who smoke salmon and store it for the harsh winter. In the same way, the Natufians, they gather like wild barley and they store it.
Yes.
And so they're settled. But and what she says is that actually, I wish I would have a quote from her here. I don't. But to paraphrase, what she basically says is that look, if that's what how you're living, you easily start having all sorts of dynamics that can almost just like you can almost slumber into agriculture. That it doesn't need to be that once you're settled, you can have a kind of revolutionary ideologue who says, why don't we start farming?
Absolutely. No, it just happened. It would happen naturally. If you become sedentary and you depend on this crop, because let's say just that you scare away some animals that are browsing on your field. Okay. That's kind of agriculture. Let's say you build a fence to do it. And let's say they drainage ditches because you just want the water to not, when it floods, you don't want it to flood. When it rains a lot, you don't want it to flood. So you can start doing all of these small little things that just at the time are just like little marginal improvements, and then over time, what this becomes is you're a farmer, and so absolutely, but you do have to become sedentary in order to start this process.
Yes, and by the way, do I remember right that contrary to what Diamond suggests, it's not that you start farming and soon you start having worse health. It's that the worse health is already there with the sedentary hunter-gatherers.
Yeah. So it's very often it's hard to pinpoint it. In the case of the Natufians, it's one of, because it's in the Middle East and because it's super studied and super excavated and because things are preserved very well in the Middle East archaeologically, then for them, we know that they're storing food. We see their granaries. They have raised floors so that the damp doesn't sort of spoil it because they don't have pottery yet, but they're not farming. And in this case, the drop in height happens with the Natufians.
And so basically the question then is not really why agriculture. It's not really why would someone decide to farm in the same way as someone might start to employ a steam engine in their factory. The question is why settle down.
Become sedentary. Yes.
And the answer to why become sedentary is because you have a harsh winter ahead and you want to store food.
Exactly.
And the answer to why does this happen around the world in a remarkably short period of time, archaeologically speaking, is because there is a climate change which increases seasonality around the tropics and in the northern hemisphere due to the axis of the Earth doing weird things that I'll probably get confused by if I try to explain.
Yeah, exactly. So the story is exactly that, and it's funny because what happens is that we have some interactions between our orbit and the orbit of Jupiter.
Okay, Jupiter plays a part in this. Good.
Yes, and as somebody who did classical high school in Italy, like I really wish it was Pluto because then it would be like Persephone and the Demeter and the myth. So this was just like
Oh, blimey, we missed that dramatic opportunity.
yes.
I
No,
do
it
think
was,
that there is a little physical challenge with getting Pluto's gravity to do
yes.
anything, but I
But if he
100%
tries really hard, if he just tried harder, I think he could. I believe in him. Uh, so terrible. But so what happens is that Jupiter it makes Earth's orbit wobble, and there's actually three kinds of wobble. And the first is the inclination of Earth's axis, and that's like right now I think it's 22 point something degrees.
Yeah, I mentioned to you before we started, I teach geography and history and these kind of things. And in geography classes, I have taught to my students that the tilt of the axis explains why there's a summer and a winter.
Yes,
Because
that's the main one. And I actually called my science teacher in high school to tell her, I ended up using.
oh, good. Well, I wish one of my students will call me back one day and say they made a major discovery.
Well, part of it is now I teach. So now I know how happy, it would make her to have a student call her. And
Yeah, of course. Well, it's really nice that you did. Really nice you did. Yeah.
so all the
yeah.
listeners, please call one of your teachers and tell them that something, how much they meant to you.
I second that. Yeah, please do. Yeah. I'll do it after this.
And tell them about the podcast. No, I'll just throw in a plug for you. So basically, what happens is that sometimes it's more tilted and sometimes it's less tilted, and it's a few degrees. It's not like an enormous amount, but it makes a difference. And then the other thing that happens is that sometimes Earth's orbit is more elliptical, and sometimes it's almost circular. And again, it's a few percentage points. It's not like an enormous amount. And then the third thing, which is very important, is the phasing between the ellipticalness of the orbit and the tilt. So, for example, right now we've just passed the summer solstice. So that means that it was the point where the northern summer solstice, which is the point where the northern hemisphere, the days were the longest and the insolation was the highest.
And that, by the way, is an easy way, I think, to visualize that the more tilted it would be, the more extreme the summer would be. Yeah.
Because if it was 90 degrees, then we would get 24 hours of daylight, which I realize for a Finn is perhaps not as surprising as, but for a
Yes, yes.
Sicilian, the entire northern hemisphere would get a
Yeah,
full
yeah,
day of
yeah, yeah, yeah.
sunlight. But when we are tilted in the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the sun, we're further away from the sun. So the two effects are canceling out.
Right now, they're canceling each other out, or
Yes, right now they're
okay.
canceling out. The summer is not quite as hot as it could be. And the winter is not quite as cold as it could be because when we're going to be tilted away from the sun, we're also going to be closer to the sun.
Okay, but this was not the case during this post-ice age, early
No.
agricultural period.
12,000 years ago, these three cycles, one of them is 22,000 years, one of them is 45,000 years, one of them is 63,000 years, but they all aligned.
Okay.
So these were worked out in exquisite detail by a man called Milankovitch and then later extended for millions of years by NASA. So what happened 12,000 years ago was that two effects were adding to each other.
So this is like basically waves being thrown in different wavelengths, but so that
Yes,
at that point they build a massive wave.
exactly. For the northern hemisphere. For the northern hemisphere, we're tilted towards the sun, we're closer to the sun, we're more tilted than usual, and the orbit is quite elliptical. And so because of this, the summers are more summery, they're warmer than any summer that you see today. And the winters are colder than any winter that you see today. And in fact, there's these ecozones that are called no analog ecozones, meaning that you see plants that are in combinations in which you don't find them today. If you go look back 12,000 years, you find conifers with grasses that you wouldn't find today. And the reason is that's what was surviving those really warm summers and those really cold winters.
So basically what's today the case in Siberia used to be the case in the more moderate climates of say Western, because Siberia is very, very actually warm in the winter.
Yes, but it would be even warmer than that.
Yeah, even more than Siberia. Okay, yeah.
Yes. So this is why they call it no analog. There's just stuff that didn't exist.
And I have to put it there, living in London, where today you can have 13 degrees and rain in Christmas and 13 degrees Celsius and rain in midsummer. That did not happen during this period.
Exactly. That would be a horrible place to start to do agriculture. It was one of the last places to get agriculture. I mean, just geographically from the Middle East. But then there's these places, and they're all sort of at the same latitude. So there's these places like Eastern North America, the Middle East, Northern China. They're all at this 35-degree latitude, which is south enough that the summer is as good as any summer that you've ever seen anywhere on the globe. But the winter is as bad as anything.
And so the broad theory, I think we have the broad theory now on the table, which is that the right question is not why agriculture. The right question is why settle down.
Exactly.
Once you settle down, if you live from salmon, well, good luck. You're never going to get agriculture from smoking salmon. But if you happen to settle down due to wild barley, you will get agriculture. Okay, so we have to explain why settle down. Why do people start settling down around the world? And the answer is because winters become wintry, summers become summery.
Yes.
And this is something that really does change during this period. But what's really striking, I mean, this sounds like a good theory, and I was kind of ready to buy this when I heard it in this kind of abstract summary. But you go much, much more into the detail, and you put the theory to the kind of to an empirical test, which, well, I mean, I've seen good papers in my life, but this was a remarkable, I think, attempt to really put this kind of sweeping theory to very, very granular tests.
Yes, it was a little bit one of those, like, Forrest Gump when he starts running and he's like, well, since I got to the end of the road, I figured I might as well run into the city. And then I got to the town, so I figured I might run to. And so it didn't set out to do this. It was just like, okay, like I figured out this one thing, and then maybe I can extend it a little bit to do this. And then, fortunately, because of all this interest in climate change, there is actually data on climate going back 22,000 years at least. Now there's probably more. And the researcher who has developed this data set, whose name is Feng He, he's a researcher at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he sent me the data, which I'll, we've never met. So it's one of those academic, he completely saved my PhD and sort of career. But one day I'll have to just send him like a case of beer. I don't know. And so what I do is I am able to test for these places that invented agriculture. I can test whether these places had higher temperature seasonality than before for the same places, and whether that temperature seasonality was higher than was present during the ice age. And for both of those, it's true.
Oh, hold on a second. Do I remember right that that's true for most of them, but for some of them it wasn't temperature seasonality. The tropical zones like Peru, it's rain seasonality.
Yes, because the interesting thing is that they're not actually the tropical season; they're the subtropical seasons.
Okay.
And wherever is like the warmest place on Earth
Yeah.
at any given point in time. So, like for the equinox, it's on the equator. That's the intertropical convergence zone. So all of the air is rushing towards that point, and then it rises. And when it rises, it creates rainfall.
Aha, the monsoon. Okay, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and then
Which
the
my Indian
monsoon-
friends have reported to me is not. It has finally been there for some weeks, and they're very, very happy. They had a very, very hard summer.
I heard it was terrible.
But they survived. They all survived, and the monsoon is there, and they're happy. And what you're saying is that this monsoon creates a kind of wet, dry seasonality.
Exactly. It moves north in the summer and it moves south in the winter. And so in the places like Mexico or the Sahel or Peru, then you get one rainy season and one dry season per year. And the rainy season is very rainy indeed, and the dry season is very dry indeed.
And to survive the dry season, you want to store some food.
Same thing. Yes. So whether it's precipitation seasonality or whether it's temperature seasonality, you get the same effect, which is that food is very abundant for part of the year, and food is very scarce for part of the year. And in both cases, if you figure out a way of storing it, then you can smooth your consumption. But to do that, you have to become sedentary.
And so basically what you did was you build a model which takes in data on climate, seasonality, spits out predictions on where would people likely farm if your theory is correct, and those tend to be the places where they do farm. And do I remember right that what you also do is you kind of take almost like a virus spread model of seeing, well, where
Yes.
does agriculture spread from these places? Some places are more resistant, other places are less resistant. And the hunter-gatherers in places with low seasonality tend to just stick to hunting and gathering much longer, and farming spreads rapidly to places which also have high seasonality.
Yes. So the contagion model, it's in the working paper. It ended up being cut for a space reason. So what I have is that I just show that the adoption of agriculture is faster. Even if you don't invent it, it arrives in places faster, in places where there's high seasonality. Because the idea is perhaps the seasonality was not quite high enough for them to become sedentary on their own, or they didn't have the storage technology, they couldn't figure it out. But they're quicker to adopt it once it's available to them.
And so the places where people don't really care about this new idea so much, where the revolution doesn't spread so much, in the same way as the communist revolution can never spread to Britain, in the same way the
Yes.
agricultural revolution does not spread to places where people either don't have this very high seasonality, like London was very
Yes,
resistant, like,
exactly.
and or places with high with a lot of mountainous differences where people, nomadic hunter-gatherers, can move between microclimates due to altitude differences. Is that right?
Absolutely. So that was specifically, I did that only in the Middle East and only in places where there was wild cereals. So it couldn't be because some places had wild cereals and others didn't, because I'm
Okay.
only looking at places with wild cereals.
Okay.
And what I show is that if you have mountains that
Yeah.
are high, but they're spread out. So it's
Yeah.
not like there's the same hill repeated all over the place. There's like a plain area and there's a mountain area, but you have to travel between them to get them. then those places delay the adoption of agriculture.
Mm.
Because
Mm.
if you become sedentary, you lose access to this other ecosystem. One of the examples of this idea of like being uninterested in farming if you have low seasonality is the people of the Sound. So the archipelago of islands between Denmark and Sweden.
Okay.
And one of the fascinating things is that they continue to be hunter gatherers for maybe like 1,000 years after their neighbors immediately to the south have started to are already farming. So they're perfectly exposed to it. And apparently, what it is that they can rely on oysters
Okay.
to fill in the gaps during the winter. There's food throughout the year because they have access to these marine resources. And then, because of continued global warming during this period, the Holocene warming, there's this pulse of meltwater from the glaciers inside the Baltic Sea. And these oysters were already at the limit of the salinity. They're saltwater oysters, and the salinity decreases and it kills off these oysters. And even though they only ate them for like a couple of months of the year, they were the only food they had for those months of the year. And so after there's this pulse of meltwater and the oysters die off, they adopt agriculture almost immediately.
Okay. That's very interesting because that does it's not the kind of story I'm used to hearing. I'm used to hearing that agriculture comes to the Northern Europe or Europe in general with migration, perhaps coercion, even theft of land. But that makes perfect sense in the light of what you've said, whether it's a general trend or not. And I think actually we should get back to the topic of coercion and migration later, because we do have to explain not only why agriculture started,
But how does it spread?
how does it spread, and most importantly, why does it spread eventually even to London
Yes.
with almost no seasonality, and why does it stick around even when we get out of this period of high seasonality? And I think there maybe we need these not purely climate based explanations, but staying on the climate explanation, I think what's really important to notice that you've kind of explained the puzzling fact of worse health, right? Because what happens is not that people adopt a technology, a lifestyle settling down, which gives them more food. They adopt a lifestyle which gives them less volatility, less risk.
Exactly. No, absolutely. And actually, what I found is that there's actually one indicator that goes in the opposite of all the others in terms of health. So it's true that they're shorter. It's true that they have worse teeth. It's true that they have more anemia because you can tell that from bones. It's true that they have more joint diseases. But there is one indicator which they have less, which is Harris lines. And basically, they're kind of like growth rings for humans. So, like the growth rings for trees. So, because we have growth rings, you have them in trees in the temperate latitudes because they have a growth season. You don't have them in the tropics because it's always warm.
Interesting.
So, humans, because we're warm blooded, as long as we're eating, it's like we're always in the tropics as far as our body is concerned. So, we keep growing throughout the year.
Okay.
But if you are growing and you have a growth arrest episode, meaning that either you were very sick or you stopped eating for some time, then your growth is going to stop. Now, if you then start eating a lot, you're going to have a phenomenon called catch up growth. Because in the earliest year, the body kind of decides, I want to make this guy 6 foot tall. And then they try to hit that target. So if there's a period in which you're not growing, if it's sufficiently short, then the body's going to grow faster to rejoin your growth curve. And this was observed for the first time, or at least it was proven during the German retreat through the Netherlands during World War II, in which there was a generation. There was a few months in which there was just no food, and
Yeah.
there was growth arrest. But then all of those kids grew up to be as tall as you would have expected them to be before there was the growth arrest.
But it leaves a mark on the bone.
But it leaves a mark in the bone. So you see these transverse lines in X-rays.
And those lines are less common in the farmers.
Yes. So the hunter-gatherers, they tended to have equally spaced lines and 5 or 6 per individual. So meaning that every year there was a growth arrest episode in certain population. Well, the farmers, they don't have them at all, or they're very, very rare, suggesting that it was like some disease. But which makes sense, right? Because if you have a granary, your problem is how much food do you have on average? You're never going to starve for a month and then have it, because if you know your harvest was bad, you're just going to space it out and eat less. But you don't have this thing where you don't eat for 2 months and then all the reindeer arrive and you kill them and you eat for 2 months a lot. So this was exactly the pattern that you don't have. So that would be my explanation for that, is that we accepted a lifestyle that had less on average but more evenly spaced out, and instead we stopped having a lifestyle in which the average was very good, but man, some periods every year were really abysmal.
And I think it's not that people suddenly became risk averse, it's that the risks became bigger with this new seasonality due to the climate change.
Yes. It is also that it's a kind of volatility which is very hard to address with nomadism. So nomadism is also a risk mitigation strategy. And the idea is there's always gonna be food somewhere, right? Like here there was a big forest fire, but I can just move 5 kilometers and that's a different place. They didn't have the forest fire. Or this place is very whatever. I can just go up the hill and different valley, different story. Okay. But the problem with the seasonality is that it's very correlated across space. So if you're a stork, then sure, it's winter in Finland. I just go to Sudan and I'm going to spend the summer there and see you next year. But if you're a human and you're
Yes.
carrying babies, you
Yes.
can't run away fast enough from winter.
Cannot go to Sudan, yeah. And so you need storage instead. So you settle down if you can, and if you happen to settle down with easily domesticatable plants, soon you find yourself being a farmer. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes. And then what happens is that once you do domesticate those plants, then, it was touch and go. It was kind of like, should we or shouldn't we when we had to be settle hunter gatherers. But once you do have those domesticated plants and you have this technology, which allows you to produce so much more food for any given unit of area relative to the hunting and gathering, then it's very hard to resist that. And you could have some situation in which we just copy it from our neighbors or we get it through trade, or we could have the situation where there's just so many more farmers and so few hunter gatherers that it just makes sense or it's just possible for the for the farmers to push out the hunter gatherers.
Yeah, and I mean that's the theory I've used to hear recently more and more, is this idea that that the spread of farming was often not the spread of ideas, but the spread of people.
Yes, the DNA data is kind of depressing on this.
Repressing in what sense?
No, I just mean that like if you look at like the DNAs of you go up in the mountains and you look for the small village which hasn't really had much admixture from anybody, and it looks like their DNA is very different from the DNA of the hunter gatherers that used to live there before agriculture,
Yeah, yes,
and very
exactly, exactly.
similar.
Yes. The European hunter-gatherers were pretty dark-skinned. We don't know how dark-skinned, but they had plenty of vitamin D from their diet, so they didn't have to evolve a light skin. And the lighter skin, ironically, comes from the south, from Levant, etc., to Europe. Weirdly, blue eyes. They were blue-eyed, dark-skinned, is what I've understood. The European hunter-gatherers.
Sounds dreamy.
Yeah, yeah,
It's a
absolutely. Yeah, it's quite funny, but yeah, that's what I was referring to earlier in the Sweden case. The Sweden Denmark case is interesting, but I think that it's clear that there's been. Let's put it this way: there's three ways in which agriculture could spread. The Sweden Denmark case would suggest, oh, this is a great idea now because climate change. Let's adopt it. That's one way. Another way is that people just move. Like Diamond suggested, it's much, you just start growing fast. You can wean children earlier. You don't need to carry them. All of these reasons. So you start growing fast. Well, my oldest son will get this farm, but what about the next daughter or whatever? And so you start spreading. So migration is the second way. And the third way is coercion and violence, which is that you are the, I don't know, Gilgamesh, king of Ur, who decides that everyone in this territory should be a farmer because that way I can tax their work. If they're a hunter-gatherer, I cannot tax them. And I will tell them that they better settle down and farm. So first of all, do you think that it's reasonable, and everybody would agree that probably all of those three ways happen? So you have ideas, you have migration, you have violence.
I think they must have happened at some percentage for
Very
sure.
good. And so we don't necessarily need to put a number estimate on the percentages, but how important do you think that not in the early adoption, but in the later adoption and the spread, these number two and number three, so migration and coercion, how important were they? Because your model, the climate model, doesn't really explain why people didn't just move. Why did people in London start farming? Why did people stick to farming when the climate changed back to being less seasonal?
Yes. So I never went super deep into the haplotype stuff. So like I don't really know the DNA evidence so well. One thing that I would a little bit push back against when people say like most of our DNA is Middle Eastern, so it looks like it was violent, is that there's really very few hunter gatherers there.
Yes, yes, yes. So you could just overwhelm the gene pool by migration without
Yes.
violence, which might have been what happened to Neanderthals. I mean, there's modeling suggesting that you really don't need any violence for sapiens to take over and Neanderthals to go extinct and stay 2% of the gene pool. Because if you have many, many more pumped out of Africa and Middle East, well, that's just kind of what ends up happening if you have and I'm 100% with you on that, but I think my suggestion about the role of violence and coercion wasn't necessarily this early spread. It was more the why did agriculture become so sticky? Might have been because you start having elites. You have soldier elites who protect the granary. They start having a lot of power. You start having the early emergence of states. Grain is very easy to tax. Hunting and gathering is basically impossible to tax. You have a lot. I mean, James Scott, for example, has written a lot about this. Whether we agree with the specific theories completely, I think that this would be one of the explanations for not necessarily the early spread of agriculture, but what the stickiness and the later spread, why it has become so dominant around the world, is not just because, well, it was a good idea for each of the farmers, but there might have been this element of coercion on top and due to state formation. What do you think of that as a kind of add-on to what the early theories need to explain?
Absolutely. So there's actually this paper from one of my advisors slash mentors, Pascali, Mauve and Pascali. And they look at sort of whether places that had the potato or like tuber crops, which are harder to transport because they're heavier. And they look at sort of, multi-level states and sort of like, hierarchies and so on. And they do find that places that are adapted for cereal crops have much more extractive states and much more, multi-level states.
Because it's easier to tax.
It's easier to tax, absolutely. Now, I think there's also just a matter of like convergence of like different things. So once you start farming and you're sedentary, another thing you can do is have technology which is too heavy to transport and too time consuming to set up in order to do it every time, like a hearth, whatever. You take some rocks, you put them, use it for a couple of months and then or a couple of weeks and then you move on. That's fine. But, like a kiln, which has to be, massive and efficient, or if you want to smelt metals. So, once you have this sedentarism, part of it is going to be these elites. And obviously, they can coerce, they can control the granary.
And they can do useful things too. They can do irrigation.
Exactly.
They can
do
do
irrigation.
calendar planning based on astronomy. When should you plant your seeds? So I don't want to go all anti-state.
Exactly. And another one that's super important is reserve stocks. So because sometimes there's failed harvests, sometimes there's delayed harvests.
Yes. Huge thing in China. Huge thing in
Exactly.
Chinese imperial history is the granaries for famine relief. Yeah.
Yes, and the ability to have like a sufficiently large area where, the shock is not going to affect the entire country. And you have these rivers, which mean that, you can have some centralized granaries. Like if every province has a granary able to feed a tenth of a province, then when there is a huge earthquake or floods or whatever in one of the provinces, then the 10 closest provinces can send their granary to that province and keep it alive. and hopefully they didn't have a shock. And so it's always, like the guy is an emperor and he demands taxes and he's very expensive and we have to keep him in very fine foods and textiles and so on. But there is, I think, always some level of give and take. Just because a guy is autocratic, just because he can do anything in principle, it doesn't mean he's going to survive very long if he does absolutely everything bad. Well, another thing I wanted to say is that people have sometimes a view of hunter gatherers that is slightly too rosy, which is partly, I think, partial reading of the Lives of the Kalahari, this book by Lee and Devore. And it's not that there's anything wrong with the book, but I think people focus on certain chapters and certain parts that are often quoted and not on other chapters. And so one of the things they say is that, like, oh, hunter gatherers had to work very little. And that is true on average. But then there's like these months of dryness, of drought, in which they have to stay very close to the only water sources that are left. And then they quickly exhaust the easily accessible foods. And then they need to work very hard indeed or walk very far to find food and then come back with the food. And again, it's one of these things where, like, on average, yes, but some periods are just unbearably miserable and worse than what most farmers have to go through. And then the other issue is with this idea that it's egalitarian. And, it is when things are going well, because obviously, you can't eat the whole elephant. But, status in a hunter gatherer community is not based on who eats the elephant when there's an elephant. The question is, when there's only a hare, who gets to eat and who doesn't it? So it's more about where you are in that pecking order, in that stack of priority to the food. Because obviously, if there's a lot of food, then yes, everybody shares and here, take this and take that. But then when there isn't quite enough for everybody, some individuals are higher status than others. And in the book, they also have the example of this widow when all her children have died. And so there's no expectation that her children could reciprocate. And then nobody shares with her. And, she's very often hungry and nobody wants to give her anything because there isn't the expectation that, like, okay, I can help her, but then her kids are going to be around. And then, like, again, this lady also, like, one of the researchers had a blanket. And one of the ladies said, like, oh, could I have the blanket? And they were friends. And she said, yes, but you're just going to give it away in like 2 minutes. And she said, all my life I've been giving stuff away and now I just want something of my own.
Okay.
So,
That's
so
I like it. Good. Good. She should have taken it. She shouldn't just give away.
yes. And again, the problem is how naked they are in front of a famine. And a lot of the field work, I suspect, is not done over long enough periods to experience that.
Oh yeah, and the researchers might pack their bags when there's no food.
Yes. The other thing is that a famine will create a kind of shadow prosperity. Because if something killed 60% of the population in a given year, the next year is a normal year and there's only 30% as many people. So that at any given point, you're probably living in the population shadow of one of these points.
Okay. Two final questions. First, I've heard you say that thinking about the origins of agriculture has also made you rethink development economics of getting out of poverty. How?
Yeah. So if you look at these, again, nothing of this is like completely unprecedented, but it just increased the salience for me at least. But typically we think of poverty in terms of like $2 a day or $730 a year or whatever, like in averages. And the reason we do this is because we have bank accounts and we have fridges and we have freezers and we have supply chains. And so what's important for us, what keeps us up at night if we have money issues, is the idea that the average amount of money will not be enough. Our issue isn't like, oh, I have a lot this week, but what am I going to eat next week? Because if that was our problem, if I have a lot, I just save some and then I can also eat next week. While for hunter gatherers, obviously this isn't the case in the sense that you might be drowning in food and in a month we're all starving, because it's as quickly as that. For farmers, it's not going to be quite as bad, but for people that work informally in cities, even for the farmers, if there's crop loss or floods, when you're that close to the subsistence limit, to like where you starve, then what's going to be important, what's going to drive your decisions is not going to be averages. It's going to be what's the worst thing that could happen to me and what's going to be the worst period over the course of a year. And so I think that, if we're going to do development interventions, things that tend to increase their risk profile, even if they're good on average, are going to be resisted very much and for good reason. Because, if I have this, it's going okay ish. Nobody's starving right now. If you tell me, like, go buy a bunch of fertilizer and go in debt in order to get it, I don't have any insurance. Even, farmers in the US and in Europe have all sorts of insurance products available. It doesn't rain. If it rains, if there's weeds, if there's pests, they can buy all of these things to reduce their risk, and still they're very exposed to risk even after all of the insurance and so on. And so I think that risk mitigation should be like a big emphasis of development, because you have to be at some level of safety before you're willing to even consider doing something weird and doing something wondrous and doing something that could increase your risk profile.
So less microfinance and more micro insurance.
Exactly. And also in terms of infrastructure and sort of, I'm building the road that's not going to wash out with the flood, so you can still get to the market. And maybe that's more important than maybe even than electrification. It's, I don't know. Like, I'm just saying, like, you have to think about how infrastructure, what are the ones that reduce the risk, and what are the ones that on average it's going to be great, but actually in that average there's 5 regions that are doing awesome and one of them died. So that was my takeaway from this.
Okay, well, before we finish, always my final question: how has your research shaped your outlook on humanity?
So for me, the way that it sort of reinforced it, I guess, is my idea that, like, we really are all people, and that, like, if you want to figure out, at least the way I do it, and for some problems it works well and perhaps for others it doesn't, but the way I got to this was just by thinking, like, what would I do? And, like, if I had this problem and you see the leaves growing red, and fall is coming, and I know winter is coming, and I'm already starting to be hungry, and then I think about, like, I'd like to have something on the side. And so I think it served me well. And just this idea that, that we're all different, but we were also all the same. It reinforced this approach to it, which is also like the way that I do economic history, is to sort of just kind of think about what I would do and then see if they had similar ideas at the time. And sometimes obviously they didn't. And in this case, like, it seems like they did, based on the data.
Dr. Andrea Matranga, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
Okay, so that was it for today, again with Andrea Matranga. If you haven't listened to it, definitely tune into the past 2 episodes if you want to learn more about different junctures in the human story where climate has played a role, not just today, but also in the past. And I have a very special episode for next week, so stay tuned. Until then, take care.